Hello everyone, today we talk about the interactions between the Celt and Germanic tribes culminating in the Germanic migrations that staunchly contributed to the decline of the same Celtic world, representing a defining saga in European military history. Obviously enough, as I think you will see from the title, this turns out to be a triangle of Celto-Roman Germanic warfare that couldn't be otherwise in these times and places, because these are truly the three dominating European ethnicities. And say just polities, because obviously there were also something different from one another, as we will see better now. It's a courageous topic to address, so to say. I could do it only after hundreds of videos about sort of the general context. We really talked about a lot of ancient Celtic warfare, and we're not through it. We're never going to be, as a matter of fact. We should talk a bit more about early Germanic warfare, as well as also a more comprehensive sort of picture of Roman expansion from these people's standpoint. All right. The reason why I make this video is that over the years I have sort of encountered, let's put it in this way, more often than not, this notion that essentially, say, admittedly not too often in absolute terms, but when anyone addressing topics in their whereabouts, like definitely rising to relative prominence, concerning a sort of Celto-Germanic resistance to Rome that would be based on some sort of dynamic alliance between the two peoples against, in fact, like imperial expansion. And that instead, more often than not, for sure, turned out to disrupt the Celtic world. I mean, great part of the reason why, the Romans even conquered Gaul is that it had definitely proven open, too easily open to Germanic invasion. There are entire Celtic provincial or even regional civilizations are basically undermined or wiped out even in any sort of politically and ethnically meaningful sense by the Germans, such as the Boy, that we also made a video on. There also the Dacians, telling the truth, were contributing to the matter. Right? It's not to say, of course, that the Celto-Germanic connection does not exist. As a matter of fact, this Transalpine dimension is quite deeply entwined, also because, as we've seen in many other videos, the classical ethnographic distinction between Germans, Celts is not made up, really, but it is applied sometimes with too much categorical and fundamentally 19th century derived concept of who these peoples fundamentally were, how they developed. Essentially, we're looking at, for everyone involved, including the Italics in the Italian peninsula, as a matter of fact, at several waves even of Indo-European peoples, largely from sort of the Central European, in fact, geographical dimension, that kept essentially pouring out of this greater corded ware, in particular, leading core that over the millennia had also already produced sort of different cultures. There is, I don't know if you look, we just recently, that video made about the Celtic Italics, you realize that not just Indo-Europeans were there way before we can fundamentally historically trace them, but they were also quite similar from one another in already that Celto-Italic axis in the West, as opposed to the Satem group in the East. So there is a great deal of relentless stratification of all these groups at some point in history, and only essentially Romantic historiography overly represented these peoples, especially in this moment of greater entwinement, essentially between the first century BC and the first AD, especially in the latter part, as far as sort of the frontier basically between Rome, and categorically separated, not sharing any major social-cultural system or spiritual, religious beliefs given their political institutional development. Naturally, it's a very complicated story, but the more I study European history, especially in comparison to the rest, right, to the surroundings, the more I realized that the entirety of the old world was swelling at this point in manpower, in a way that hadn't there been a conflict even within Europe, which is a theme, of course, recurring also in the following millennia, uniquely enough, you could have not had this power to begin with, right? You know that on Schwerpunkt we tend to browse the sort of the traditional and the metaphysical wisdom and conceptions of these peoples. I also made a video back in the day about the Romano-Celto-Germanic virtus, mostly from Tacitus, Vegetius, but Vegetius, if you prefer the ecclesiastical pronunciation for later antiquity, but also describing the same Germans, more at that point, more often than not, but naturally being there plenty of, like with Caesar, that in fact is included in the title, the same Gallic word in particular, the Britons, etc. So this video is not meant to be a definitive and or exhaustive in particular introduction to the topic. In fact, I decided to pick exactly this lens, the fact that the Romans, by conquering the Celtic world, basically received a mandate from the same Celts to protect them from the Germans. And this is regardless of the deep syncresis that existed in many elements of both, in fact, of a Celto-Germanic reality, identity, and more, that also at some point fought against Rome. Overwhelmingly, what we see, as also later Roman imperial history, is a large Celto-Roman continuity in stemming essentially a Central Eastern Northern European barbaricum, right, of less developed but sort of more warlike or at least tumultuous, unstable populations. I didn't mean to cross out warlike, which is a proper definition, but if you look at the Roman military from the other side, and also like the pretty good service, in fact, of the Romanized populations conquered also across the Celtic world, and their contribution first as auxiliaries, then as proper Romans against these issues, so to say, coming from the frontiers, undeniably in fact, Celto-Roman reality that presents also drastic continuity in the Middle Ages, especially in Western, post-Roman Europe, in terms of civilizational achievement. Essentially, that bell-beaker Celto-Italic block is what continues throughout the Middle Ages to dominate the system, right? I see people often sort of thinking that claims of also imperial rule, at least of formal subjection, equates to simply a conquest, right? We have to talk more about how, for example, Romance languages spread as opposed to the Germanic ones, because very often you find this, especially on X nowadays, that there is nothing wrong about Norse or Germanic history in general, stressing certain elements of ancestral sort of primigenity, of certain mystical context and so on. The picture is actually much darker than it seems, but there is this overstatement, essentially, of also Germanic demographic power, right? If you look at what the Romans accomplished during antiquity, that should be sung way more, like by scale, that what the Germanic world was able to accomplish, also because the limits of the Germanic world were almost completely the ones of Romance languages in the Middle Ages. If anything, the Germans expanded more, re-expanded, by the way, from antiquity, once again, in the East, more than else, right? But in this sense, you find this medium in between, like that is the Celtic world, which is also, again, an incredibly difficult reality to actually define as such, like the strongest sense of a truly, even linguistically speaking, even sticking to nomenclature, self-definition of the Celtic world was interestingly concentrated in essentially Gaul and Britain, which sounds in that case like a modernistic meme because of, I don't know, the eventual importance of Britain or France, but it's actually not the case. It was really the case. Obviously, the Celts stretched from Portugal to Ukraine, in fact, from Ireland to, that this is sort of famously Celtic in that regard, but to Galatia. While there is no doubt, I personally subscribe to these identities not being mere fabrications or something that you have to overly sophisticatedly sort of relativize on the basis of historiographical elucubration. However, were so expansive in their migrations, in their invasions, that to an extent it's very difficult, also considering also the other peoples that dwelt in such areas, to determine even how they saw each other in any concrete sense, right? And it's not that easy, as you know, with ancient sources to actually describe that. If you dig into that, if you look at their sort of identity and spiritual views, sort of worldview, they all seem much more European, much more Indo-European, in legacy, in costumes, in language, in shared universal traditional references than sort of anything else. All right. This applies again also to the Romans, but for some reason that idea that somehow the successful barbarian takes over civilization radically counterposed these two worlds in later times in history by overstating certain dynamics and essentially even deleting properly others from not much necessarily historiographical, but the comprehensive, also popular horizon, which are somehow disturbing. And in fact, that's what I wanted to criticize more than else, this notion that since there are well-documented affinities between the Celts and the Germans in terms of, we've seen them in the video about the Celto-Italics and the correspondences with Germanic, with Tocharian, from a strictly linguistic point of view. But today we will look at this, if anything, from a political and military standpoint. That is to say, actual power, how these dynamics actually occurred, and essentially what intensity, even the capacity, for example, of Celtic resistance, was also the same one of Germanic expansion in comparison. And the sort of ultimate conclusion is astonishing in favor of Rome for many reasons. Without further ado, but these introductions are always necessary because the topics are so big that you can't quite immediately make, I don't know, the 15 minutes video acting as if you were citing books that you would have allegedly read to, I don't know, to have people think even in more simplistic and superficial terms than they already do. We must have clear fundamentals. I will also spare you the notion that I've encountered in these years. You find all sort of Roman fanboys, Germanic fanboys, but when it comes to the Celts, for some reason, there is some sort of rhetoric of the lost cause, forever complaining about the Celts being some sort of third millennium civilization compared to Rome that mysteriously was able to take them over. Nobody really realizes how, if they were weak, it's because, I don't know, then the Romans were actually more powerful, or if because they were sort of better, but they were incapable of conquering others. Obviously, this makes no sense, and the most obvious realization is, of course, that Rome was a civilization together with another very sort of specific set of other civilizations out there, and the Central European world, the sort of the broader Celtic interland, was as big as loose, as sort of lacking cohesion and capacity in that sense to actually unite, as some of these people somehow think that they should have done for Norway, as if they knew better than a Celtic shift and what the reality was at the time. That's the thing that always makes me think, as if today's people had any clue, not just about their ancestors, but what they actually believed. And I mean, today's people for real, knowing the sub-quality of today's people, of course, and what their broader capacities were. Now, for many of the topics I will be addressing today, I already made hundreds of videos altogether, right? So it's useless even to try to presume that you have to remind me something and then going out there whining because I blocked you in the comments when you start spamming or saying idiotic things. Now, the Celts emerged as a formidable military and cultural force, as we well know, around the 8th century BC in Central Europe, occupying regions such as Bohemia, Switzerland, Austria, southern Germany, and northern France. Right, these were more or less their major core land, or is associated with the Hallstatt culture. So roughly, and really roughly, because some of these stages are relatively conventional, not too much was changing in absolute terms, but in their relative terms, that was actually very fast. We're between essentially the, say, 800 to the mid-5th century BC. The Celtic martial prowess was evident in archaeological finds from sites like the same Hallstatt, obviously, in today's Austria, where over 2,000 Iron Age graves contained iron swords, daggers, bronze helmets, and intricately decorated armor, indicative of a warrior elite commanding significant resources that eventually gave the name historiographically to from the place, from the toponymy to this entire stage of Celtic expansion and this Celtic sub-era. Now, by the 5th century, we pass also famously enough to the Latin culture. And so this is mostly right mid-5th century BC to the 1st century BC, depending on sort of where you want to count even there, marking the zenith of Celtic military and artistic development, with their influence at this point stretching clamorously across Western Europe from the Iberian Peninsula to the Balkans, northern Italy, and the British Isles. And not only, as we said before. Celtic military organization was, however, decentralized. At least it was not, obviously, stemming from a cohesive, unitary political power. This early phase of expansion is the heroic one, truly, where also classical civilizations look at these Central European peoples and they can depict, in fact, the peak of their military quality, right? This expansion relies as such also, as it was basically self-fueling itself, tribal war bands led by nobles equipped with famously iron chainmail, long slashing sword, javelins, and large oval shields, right? The Celts were actually not the only ones fighting like that. There is a debate where chainmail was first created. It was apparently, like it mostly happens, like a steppe. At least it was used also in the steppe at some point in history before it became mainstream among the Celts. And even older chainmail fragments date to Etruscan Italy, as a matter of fact. So we will talk more about this because I have a video incoming on the history of metallurgy. I also made one already explaining what will end up in any case for the Celts as a warlike people, their arms and armor inheritance among the same Romans and Germans. Right? On this, I would like to open a massive excursus because since modern people are very technologistic, they assume that since the Celts and especially their fabulous elites, that were really something, individually speaking, in terms of heroic military culture, and especially at this point, had such highly crafted panoply, that alone would be fundamentally an indicator of absolute civilizational advancement. It is not really like this. In the past, of course, since the same Bronze Age, there had been important advancements in the same Central Europe, to say the least, in terms of arms and armor. That's something we will go back, in fact, in time in other videos to show well. But when we talk about this, the message spreads that, for example, the Romans would have fundamentally just copied Celtic equipment, while they had basically, like any other people in Europe, the same identical equivalent. Right? It doesn't matter if we're talking about more curved or sort of straight blades. The scutum, also in the oval form, is italic in origin. Across, it doesn't make any sense to presume that there was any sort of technologistic mechanism in the spread of these types of weapons. All over Europe, the equipment was fundamentally the same. Like a guy with a helmet, if sort of more affluent, some form of metal armor, an oval shield, couple of javelins / spears, and to go to battle as that. Like this was the case also in some part of North Africa, in Mashrek and beyond. So really nothing strange. Again, Europeans fought in dramatically more similar ways, in especially their sanitary abode, than we sort of usually give them credit for. The Celts, however, did earn an extraordinary reputation with their war bands at this very point, due to the fact that, as we were saying before, these were picked units, right? There were some larger Celtic migrations, also in significant numbers. I covered sort of the history of different Celtic tribes, including the Skordiski. We talked about Galatian arms, say, if anything, armies organization. We look at Gaul and so on. These movements happened, but at large, the Celt, at least in the broader classical world, was mostly associated in this early Latin period, in particular, with war bands. They were picked units of sworn brotherhoods of sacred character that, being veritable steamrollers, because they were the equivalent of a professional force, they didn't have the societal or, in that sense, also political structures to have a full professional army like the Romans will essentially manage already much earlier than is also commonly credited to create. But in this sense, with this errant, almost knightly, hadn't they been mostly footmen in any case, even though they had, I would say now, good cavalry, permeated the ancient world. You find them really everywhere, used as mercenaries as far as Egypt, as Carthage. They were really something. And their quality, including their equipment, often was also the product of destroying better armed and armored enemies, which absolutely makes sense, because it doesn't just take to be more also materially advanced to be military superior. If anything, what we should appreciate the Hells force, not much the fact that, yes, they had pretty cool arms and armor and general style, even aesthetically speaking. That's even an important thing. It has psychological impacts on the battlefield. But if anything, their moral force. This is what really matters, right? Their warfare, however, will tend, as the cake cools off and the Celts are mostly stabilized around the frontier of the sort of Mediterranean civilization, to some softer lifestyle and gradual loss of also individual liberty under more affluent aristocracies that tended, as always, to disarm, even though they weren't particularly successful. It depends on where you look at. Let's say the more advanced Celts, frankly, were located in Gaul, in parts also to the same neighboring Central European areas. When you look at the Britons, they were, for example, the Celtic people that stuck more to the sort of heroic style of warfare that had also a deeper ancestral connection. Think about the Druidic schools and sort of sacred sanctuaries in the British Isles, but were also the ones with the lower, actually the lowest military quality of the entire Celtic world, right? And they were in fact also conquered pretty easily by the Romans. But even a much more advanced Gallic world would basically give way to the Romans in 8 years. And this is something that we will see today better, considering the Germanic factor into it, right? Because it really entwines with the entire Roman conquest and everything. It's not even like some would think, oh, it hadn't been for the Germans, pressuring the Celts, the Romans would have not conquered the Celtic border. No, it would have happened anyway, because that stratification, we will get now to the relation between the Celts and the Germans better, was, if you take away the label Celt and German, you will understand how, even in fact, the Germanics from the north were more primitive, less developed, but morally loaded, pressuring a bit like the earlier Celts had been mostly by, it's a moral thing. Like people say, oh, it's migration, it's climate, it's, if it started being too warm and more children survived, there wasn't enough to sustain them agriculturally speaking with, and so they would go out there. Yeah, that's also a thing. That's also something you can document for the Italics, for lots of other peoples, for their migration needs. If you look at the steppes, that's also very much ingrained in that nomadic sort of just tantamount of resources that you can graze in a particular part, especially of this region, to maintain a distinct political cohesion and military expandability. It's important to have, again, because this is not part of the intro, but obviously it gets a bit more into the specifics the more we progress, but if you don't have the bigger picture clear in mind, it's sort of a bit difficult to realize how even certain military systems began to fade, right? The Celts had, as we explained, nothing really much like a state to back their civilization. They reached extraordinary level of development by Transalpine standards at the time. I recently made a video about the Latin Oppida. As a matter of fact, I really talked a lot about this gradual change in Celtic warfare, right? That would essentially make them crumble against both the Romans and the Germans. The Celtic tactics emphasized rapid, chaotic charges, often from concealment, accompanied by war cries and supported by skilled horsemanship. In some regions, chariots are described by Diodorus Siculus. It's even unfair to say that there was anything chaotic at any point in any kind of warfare, meaning that the Celts did definitely had specific military training, discipline, and were absolutely capable of fighting in compact, heavy infantry lines, just like other peoples were, right? The fundamental passage, however, in the capacity of linear development, passing from, say, march to line formation, being able to carry out combined armed tactics in a sort of more articulate way, the one that the Romans, you see, arrived by the Second Punic War. As a matter of fact, it had been developing in the Hellenistic one, including in this, if you want, by strictly speaking, military school, the St. Carthaginian one, were in theory already in Mediterranean. Like the Greeks had adopted properly tacticae as such. I made an entire video about this also in regarding the genesis of so-called hoplitism from the Assyrians, from other peoples actually in between, from the Indo-Europeans of Anatolia, etc. And it's a very gradual passage. I also made videos, for example, about the Battle of the Allia River that sort of tells us something very important about how, at that point, at the beginning of the 4th century BC, the Romans and the Gauls used to fight. And already at that point, the Romans were more advanced than the Celts, but they could suffer a defeat of that kind that brought to some further development of, in fact, the Roman art of war, a sort of deeper mutual support between units, something sort of more complex, even in terms of deployment capacity, gradual reserves, usage, and so on, right? The Celts, however, were definitely limited in their military capacity. We explained this many times, I will not repeat myself, but essentially there was not enough political and social cohesion on a meaningfully large scale to provide with more than sort of routine raid hosts that could be impressive and loaded also in men and being capable, of course, of defeating the Macedons, the Romans at the time, but at the end of the day, going nowhere in a broader civilizational sense, right? Because these forces were not held together, if not by their sort of individual ambitions of the various war bands. There was, of course, a broader sense of hierarchy, of sacred royalty, of, if anything, of imperial worldview. It's absolutely false and injurious, actually, to claim that the Celts did not have the same sort of providential awareness of other peoples in terms of sort of conquests, desires, and especially the ones of ruling over others, etc., as if they were the only peoples who evaluated freedom or something like that. The harsh truth is that Celtic society did not have simply the surplus and the power concentration to provide with an iron-fisted authority and discipline, and especially the resources, in fact, to train large formations and supplying them for a long time, right? And this is not a good thing, right? This is not like something you can excuse. There is probably a rigid hierarchy of civilizational development where the Celts ultimately fell short of. Naturally, if you look at these hosts in battle, you would have actually as visibly realized how sort of certain armies were more or less trained, armed, disciplined, and so on. But they also fought overall in pretty similar ways. I mean, if you had seen, again, a Germanic host fighting against a Roman one, there aren't even in that case sort of too many examples. Like we will see essentially the majority of them at this stage in history. But let's say with the Celts, there were also encounters of this kind. Normally, the sort of these peoples tended not to fight in open field pitched battles against the Roman army once, of course, they immediately realized the standards. But in many occasions, this had also happened, and you would have probably, that's not a matter of equipment that, again, was really similar, as we were saying before, and not just because of mutual exchange in a sort of peaky, sort of selective, categorical sense, but because the art of war was more or less the same. Like these large forces of heavy infantry deployed in multiple battle lines, depending, usually the Celts did not have as much of a sort of reserve control as the Romans had, but normally cavalry wings trying to outflank one another. Mostly, in fact, military logic proceeding on that basis rather than any particularly different, more or less sophisticated formation, battle array. By the way, even about the Roman one, we know dramatically few, right? Especially by the time we were fighting against the Celts, because Polybius at least tells us a lot about the Macedonian wars, about, as we've seen recently also, the Iberian ones, naturally also prior with Carthage in particular. So all things that we will deal with in particular soon, because I really want to ramp up production in those teams. Chariot warfare is interesting in Celtic history. Sort of, I don't know, chariot warfare is the one that had projected further into Europeans across Eurasia at an unprecedented level, but historically, like the formation, in fact, of tougher infantries in the Mediterranean since the times of the Sea Peoples brings to a profound crisis of chariot warfare that, in fact, remains by essentially the end of our period here only in places like Britain, North Africa, so everything in between, except maybe some Belgian here and there, and just for sort of parade purposes, also other symbolic ones, even including among the elites of the empire that kept at some point being buried with horses and chariots, by the way, had taken definitely a different turn. In fact, the late Latin Gallic armies that we described often on Schwerpunkt were something definitely more organized, like strategically, logistically performing. But also in that case, they weren't structurally or radically different from the, say, I don't know, the ones of the Belgians or the same Germans, right? It wasn't this stage in terms of sort of military step up that some people maybe got from, I don't know, video games. You have to unlock that level, update your army's military reforms. The entire concept of military reform is very contentious, even for the Roman army, at least in the sense of change from a moment to another. Armies largely developed by themselves, and autocratic rulers don't come really to alter much of that, if not by sort of fully formalizing it, as it happened for Marius, and regardless of their military skill, because obviously, yes, there is a reason if Marius was attributed his own reform, military reform, but in practice it was just like a legal reform. It had really very few to do with the way the Roman army already functioned at that time. Celtic warriors excelled in individual combat, especially when we're talking about these professional units like the Solduri war bands of the late Latin period in Gaul. Also, just because of their original heroic tendencies that were also a relic of sort of an older era and did not reflect, in fact, a particularly updated warfare, as explained for the Britons as well. So the average Celtic warrior is often sort of in pop culture identified with the war bender, right, of the early phase of sort of Latin Celtic expansionism. But at home, like the majority of their quote-unquote warriors were fundamentally just some levies, right? There were some peasants that were, yes, habituated to raids, abuse, general brutality, cattle stealing, throat cutting, a bit like in the Middle Ages. Some even spoke of a proto-feudal society of the Celts. It makes sense if you want to use the term feudal. I used it also for the pre-Camillian Roman military, because definitely Roman society in many ways was based on those large estates, etc. And a bit like in the Middle Ages, the elites definitely, the mounted, heavily armored warriors that also in the Celtic were actually dismounted to fight on foot. That's also the sake of the chariot at some point, that had to bring the warrior in the middle of the fray and then pick him up when things got a bit more complicated, when it was deemed to have showed off enough, would eat, for example, more fat and proteins. But the wide majority of the Celts were always agriculturalists. There wasn't even this. We know pretty well what sort of pre-industrial societies kind of look like. The average what we'd call Celt would have been really unimpressive. They weren't really Conan the Barbarian kind of look. This is at large true also for the Germans, in spite of the fact that we're sort of even more biologically selected by sort of their general warfare and brutality, other than, as people say, like the climate, the environment. No, this is fundamentally very much political, very much moral, indeed. And as we will see, in fact, the Germans came to be sort of more militarily performant than the Celts, so much so that the Belgians, the Helvetii, that were essentially Celto-Germanic peoples, and so now we'll try to understand how the Romans tell us preferred, especially the former two, claim themselves like of Germanic ancestry rather than Gallic one, because they thought that the Gauls were soft and corrupted because of Mediterranean influences and so on. Unfortunately, I would like to digress for each of these topics because we already discussed them, but they are an evergreen and it's always a pleasure to address them. But it's important to distinguish individual combat and collective one, because again, the heroic idea of a single guy going out there never happened. Like heroic warfare, as far as we understand in historical, prehistorical sense, never occurred, right? At least if we stick to what we know, humanly speaking, according to these people's traditions. Of course, something else is true, but at least in this time, we covered today, we know that, of course, it was always a matter of collective training, and that's where Celts were scarce, right? People, for example, believed that Celtic equestrian force was, oh my God, there were so many. And this actually stems just from the Romans that observed that the Celts had a lot of cavalry, and even if it was not particularly qualitative compared to the Roman one, it actually was very high in quality, and many people do not understand how or why that is the case. I made an entire video to explain that with comparative diachronic military history, including like Roman, Carthaginian, in that sense also Numidian warfare, where the Romans were really spectacular in terms both of sort of numeric ratios, outcomes, and including cavalry commanders. I mean, Laelius is much better cavalry commander than Massinissa as well. So there are some cliches that paradoxically are also misinterpretations of what the Romans say. The terrible Romans that apparently, like according especially to Celto fanboys, have made up history. It's all propaganda, And so everything that we know actually about ancient warfare through ancient sources is overwhelmingly accurate, if not properly correct, and it makes sense all around, anthropologically, militarily, culturally, and more, right? And in fact, it's not to say that the Celts were poor equestrians individually. They actually were pretty darn good at that, but collectively it was something else. Like, you can't have a strong cavalry if the numbers of this are as small, and in the major expeditions of different tribes that have all different easterns, and so you put these groups of 20 horsemen next to another that do not know each other, have never trained together, so they know their deal, and they are also employed by the Romans because they're good. Right, nothing exceptional. I mean, there were many other pretty darn good horsemen in the senator world in Europe that could claim basically the same standards. I mean, even the Germans, paradoxically, that had less cavalry force, especially from a numerical standpoint, famously enough, in the Commentarii del Bello Gallico are provided by Caesar with adequate mounts, and they beat the hell out of the Gauls on horseback. So that's also quite fascinating, a topic that I haven't covered yet among the various. So Celtic warriors definitely excelled in individual combat. When we talk about properly warriors, professional, the elite, the nobility, with their cavalry, because, obviously if you were poor, you couldn't much have a horse. and in this sense often noble-led, wielding javelins and swords in swift, harassing attacks. However, their reliance on loosely organized infantry, drawn from lower classes with often inferior weapons, and their lack of centralized command made them vulnerable to disciplined opponents, a weakness that would prove fatal against both Germanic tribes and Roman legions. Right? This is really typical. Big wave of conquest. At that point, you have the spearhead being very qualitative, and that's the early Latin Celtic war bands that look like, also in the eyes of those who were receiving them from the other end, as pretty angry, well equipped by sort of the through the spoils of the killed opponents, etc. Like as probably the breakthrough force that went also not much anywhere in terms of major polities building. I mean, it's not that the Galatians ever represented a major threat to any of the neighbor in absolute terms. They were a polity on their own. They had their army. They were dangerous, but let's say there was a great deal of stability of other powers rising and falling all around. After this wave, most people not just soft up, but they are in these societies essentially ever more controlled by an elite that controls most of the system, so they can produce good troops, very good troops even, but never in quantitative numbers because they have to keep this broader population under control, right? So I will skip here any further consideration in terms of how many Celts actually migrated from a demographic point of view, how many were the conquered peoples, who were in the sense the Celts by different, throughout all these various centuries. You would be surprised naturally by how allogenic they would look in the later period with one another. They were truly sort of different populations. Now, the Germanic tribes, instead, originating in southern Sweden, the Danish peninsula, and northern Germany between the Ems and Oder rivers, emerged later, at least in history. By the time of Caesar and Tacitus, for still quite a long time, they were literally prehistorical peoples. The Celts had, also the Germans, obviously, they had their own script. They used it in sort of very different ways, from sort of even anything approaching to literature, not even a fully fledged one. I mean, the Romans arrived there basically during the 3rd century BC themselves, and they were the ones that eventually spread literacy across the entire continent. The early context between Northern Europe and the Etruscan world, also in terms of the Etruscan script and so on, very well studied in many ways. So again, they were all much more similar peoples than we intend, but they weren't very interested, at least in great literary production, just per se. It is true that their script had a higher transcendental meaning and importance in the wake of Indo-European tradition, legacy. If you tour places like Reddit that are naturally like sort of very woke to great extent, if you say anything like, I don't know, things like the food, the runes were magic, like you're a neo-Nazi of some sort. Notoriously, like, there is literally nothing about Indo-European culture, identity, etc., that did not attribute a divine value to literally everything, depending by degree, and especially to the runes that also in sort of Norse mythology have a very specific sort of function, also as far as Woden himself is concerned. So I don't like this downplaying this depletion of spiritual and sort of qualitative dimension of these populations, etc. We must understand who they were and what they did. So little premise. When we talk the Germans here, obviously there are some historians who claim that at least boundaries between the Celtic and the Germanic world would be disputed, in part because they tend to attribute two distinctively, sort of positively distinctive separation and identification to begin with of these Central European peoples and Northern European peoples, what is in between in particular, as respectively like Celtic, Germanic, etc. It is absolutely true, as we will see now also during the Cimbrian migration and so on, that there were some Celtic groups among the Germanic ones, and sometimes we don't understand what these terms would have meant for them at the time. I made some of my earliest videos about Germanic history explaining literally what historiography, especially at the time, was stuck to. There is nothing wrong in sort of conventional historiographical terms to sort of ideally and really conventionally tracing this separation. Naturally, there was a great similarity, great proximity, right? Where you can better separate them is truly feeling their political, military, moral pulse. And so that's also why I made this video, because these different waves of peoples were truly sort of organic, systemic. They aren't arbitrary. The boundary between the Celts and the Germans is not merely a classical ethnographic fabrication, right? The early Germanic culture associated with the Jastorf these are all sort of essentially archaeological horizons, so we're talking 6th to 1st centuries BC, is really the first clearly outlined sort of, at least historically, historic Germanic people that we can start following also the political, military events of, other than just archaeological finds, archaeogenetics and stuff. Now, their early military culture was less advanced than the Celts. There is absolutely no doubt, for obvious reasons. Northern Europe was much less developed than Central one, with limited access to metal, resulting in reliance on wooden or leather shields that were, again, also, however, the norm in other places. Long lances, the frame, and short swords, which shouldn't, again, draw too many sort of distinctions. There is always a sense, obviously, that the elites imported stuff from pretty far away places, and in fact, Germanic elites at this point looked very much Celtic. And an underrated aspect of this is that the Germans initially dramatically looked up to the Celts, even though they were essentially their primary enemies during their migrations and expansion, the target of their conquest, of their invasions. And this for the obvious reasons that they were the more developed people around that they knew, right? Germanic warriors fought in tight cooperative formations, often described as quote-unquote phalanx-like, not meaning that they had phalanxes. This is also not true for the Celts. Like, remember, phalanxes, the term phalanx etymologically is a very generic one. The same Hellenes used to describe literally any kind of heavy infantry out there without any specific sort of characteristic, right? But the term that we use for phalanx in strictly sort of classical Hellenic and later Hellenistic Macedonian sense is something extremely specific that no other people ever adopted. This is incredibly important to stress. Like, you still have people following Connolly's mistranslations from the Loeb translator that even gave life to horrifying Osprey representations of Carthaginians using the pike, like the Macedons, and sort of the same type of organization, military organization and follow. This never happened. Nobody had that, right? So phalanx-like here mostly is this thick, compact, rolling trunk that is essentially what the same Hellenes considered them like. There's also the wedge-shaped formation that has been sort of pretty uncontroversially explained, not being literally like a triangle where there is a first guy at the top that breaks the enemy lines, whatever. That would have had especially the best soldiers killed immediately. The wedge is rather like one section of the battle line that naturally can be of sort of tens of thousands of men. There are subunits, and the most performing one, the one led by the leader, would essentially be deployed in a position also facing an enemy opponent. Warfare would sort of, the more tribal, the more sort of clinic it is, the more personal it is, right? But in a position that would be more tactically efficient, the Germans did not make overwhelming use of cavalry, so it was truly about sort of face-to-face clash. It's a bit like when you look at the Vikings compared to, I don't know, the Carolingians back in the 9th century. And there, in fact, like you have the pig snout formation, etc., that actually refers to the staggered following, like say the staggered position of the various units following the section of the line that would essentially charge at the enemy. So it wasn't literally a triangle. It was like the staggered units following the first one, leaving, charging at the enemy as a sort of wedge, right? Because that was like the point of the Germans as well, like prioritizing this sort of cohesive smash against enemy units. Great charges we've seen also in late antiquity being very performing against Roman infantry as well, with the Alemanni. If you look at the Angon and all these weapons that had at some point the same degree of penetration of the Roman pilum back in the day. And the Germans, at least compared to the Celts, seemingly prioritize group cohesion over individual heroics, at least in historiography. What this really means is two-dimensional, right? So when the Celts expanded, as we've seen largely for also to be documented by other peoples during the Latin era, the same art of war was more primitive at the time, right? And so this greater compaction of the lines was something relatively novel in the Mediterranean. So you couldn't even expect the Celts to be particularly remembered for being incredibly cohesive. They would be. There are some big battles, the one of Telamon, many instances in which Celtic battle lines were sort of cohesive enough, obviously, to even destroy like the Roman ones, etc. Because that was some sort of basic type of warfare at the time. What truly mattered was, again, the collective training, or at least the coordination of the various units in between, because there is a difference between simply line up different clans following their leader and having in a battle line and then going and attacking, compared to having a formation can simply move, also sort of wheel, pass quickly from column from march to line, battle line formation. In that sense, the Celts had been less performing. About the Germans, we start learning about the Germanic warfare in a concrete, what matters, sort of open field and more collective sense. It's not about weapons more than much or archaeological finds. Again, there is nothing really special overall about sort of the differences among these peoples from in terms of hardware. But we also see sort of a slightly more advanced type of warfare that has spread, if anything, by Roman osmosis, because the same Germans, the same Celts at some point did imitate Roman warfare to an extent. And so we get also from the much longer Germanic history of late antiquity, early Middle Ages, and so on, that of course the Germans were naturally more cohesive than what the early Celts had, right? So there is a bit this perspective distortion that, however, is also supported at different times, given that, again, early Celts and early Germans are relatively detached in time, relatively to our capacity of documenting them respectively, with specific descriptions of, say, Germanic warriors when withdrawing, not doing like the Celts, like they launch themselves, and if they in the assault, and if they don't break the enemy line at the first hit, like they fall back immediately. It's a bit the stereotype of the Celts, all right? Whereas the Germans were at some point described as, if things were getting worse, like being able to pull out of the fray by sort of disciplinedly withdrawing, pulling back their wounded and all this stuff. And this is, if anything, supported by what we know as a whole, so in the comparison between the Celts and the Germans, as they were fighting against one another, with the Germans being a much more cohesive people, right? Nationally, if you want to use this term, right? Naturally understood also in a more classical sense. In fact, actually the highest military quality Celts were notoriously, we said before, the Belgians and the Helvetii, or the Helvets if you prefer, because they had routinely been fighting against the Germans, were partly German, and had preserved a greater sort of cohesion. The metus hostilis, just to say it the Latin way, and they were just more powerful. It was all about political cohesion. It wasn't about what kind of weapons they used or what kind of tactics. They had fought all pretty much in the same way. There isn't really any meaningful difference across the Celtic world of how they fought, or even initially with the Germans. Like if you're trying to research this, like it's just a waste of time. There are much more important things to understand here that are also, in fact, the ones that people have greater difficulties with because they're simply more difficult to understand as well, require more more education. And so we understand that ideally a Germanic host was sort of tougher, more courageous than a Celtic one by especially the 1st century BC. All right, and as we'll see now, lots of interesting things had occurred. The Germans were also largely agriculture, telling the truth, but they had a more pastoral lifestyle with at least less developed, sort of quote-unquote minimal agriculture focused on grains and livestock, fostering mobility, enabling large-scale migrations that would challenge Celtic territories. All right, this mobility is not uniquely sort of semi-nomadic in matrix. Again, these peoples are somehow similar. Much of Germanic expansion occurred in sort of very slowly, very gradually. There were early infiltration. We know very few, especially what was happening in Central Europe outside of the sort of direct range of the Roman raider, right? But we kind of understand this in multiple ways. Also because fundamentally, like, sort of the difference, again, between Celts and Germans is very difficult to clearly understand. Also, their language was very similar, telling you the truth. Like, if you look at a certain, Ariovistus is, look, so this was actually a Gallic title, but if you actually look at the Germanic from quite a while, it was the same term, like it's noble with sort of a providential view. It's Arios Vesos, it's the same thing in Germanic. So these were, of course, metaphysical names of different rulers, like Vercingetorix, that was Vercingetorix Rex, right? And in general, the Celts had been the stronger power. Again, the Germans sort of looked up to them, but they would sort of fight and sort of destroy them in significant ways. We know of certain oppida that were basically destroyed by the Germans, that were basically switching from some great markets to some sort of grim military, sort of militarized avampost at some point. So this is very important. Germanic expansion was not particularly happy for the Celts, right? It was actually a disaster for them more often than not, right? If some groups, as they did, sort of mingled, also siding against Rome, different war bands definitely joined from different places. There is absolutely no doubt, but it's like saying, during the migration era, there were Celto-Germanic auxiliaries, by the way, as much as there were Celto-Germanic pirates, raiders, but say what happens with the Germans in Britain, say, for example, it's not something that goes very much in favor of the Celts in that sense. So learn how to make comparisons, because nobody can say that it was, a free world that was fighting against the terrible Sauron, and, everybody was, for the former was against Rome, and they were all joining forces, like in the Lord of the Rings, like for fraud or whatever. It's just like a mental illness, right? If you know the Lord of the Rings, but you do not know what Catholic means in pre-Christian times, traditionally speaking, it's better if you visit a psychiatrist, right? Now, archaeological evidence from Jastorf sites, such as iron weapons and simple pottery, suggests a warrior society that, while less sophisticated than the Celts, was adaptable and resilient, right? The Germans were habituated to a much more radically traumatic level of brutality compared to the wide majority of the Celtic world by the time of, sort of, say, the Cimbrian migration. By the 3rd century BC, environmental pressures like flooding in their northern homelands and population growth drove Germanic tribes south and west, encroaching on Celtic lands east of the Rhine, such as the Main Valley, where tribes like the Helvetii were gradually displaced to modern Switzerland, for example, even though we should explain better what we mean by that, because different groups called themselves different ways, and they were also later documented just by other peoples as well. Most of this was actually just the product of sort of identity. It's not like there were some peaceful Germans that at some point, oh, look, we are in the midst now of a flood, or, it's like we don't have food for our children. We're simply going to now switch to, warfare because, look, we can. These were eminently warrior cultures, right? There was a very radical sense of inferiority and superiority, of divine power, and it is all manifested through a brutal pursuit of systematic subjugation, primarily by the way of their own peoples. I mean, largely the greatest bloodshed that occurred among the Celts and Germans were against sort of their respective ethnic boundaries. That's also why they were sort of warlike societies. They were constantly battling, enslaving, raping, and massacring each other on a regular basis. To nothing that the Romans, frankly, added much to, if not much sort of greater efficiency. This aspect is fascinating because if you want to turn the Celts or the Germans into some, again, freedom-loving, some sort, at that point you should say, why were even they fighting one another? Right? Even the deterministic answer of some sort of materialistic, structuralistic explanation doesn't hold water because their entire, and we've seen it very well in our Indo-European theology series, their entire language, just like, I don't know, the Roman one did, the Hellenic and so on, were exclusively based on holy war. Right? If you do not know this about Indo-Europeans, you don't really know much about them to begin with. So it would have been humiliation for them to be misrepresented as either sort of lovers of peace, if not through arms, because, by the way, Frieden in German is exactly that. Like, it's a peace in arms, as a matter of fact, which also makes a lot of sense. I mean, this is what we should pursue it. I mean, it's a superior moral value in general. That's also why what the Celts or the Romans believed in the same terms. There is all a very sort of architectonically exuberant theology about this that will explain very much also for the Romans. So this counterposition, these peoples against one another in terms of especially racialistic 19th century sympathies or antipathies, is just the measure of how much less of a human being you are compared to your ancestors. And their greatest point was conquest, conquering and lording over other peoples specifically. Right, this was the greatest honor that anybody could have in terms, probably as a divine reward that had to elevate the entire world, being properly ordered by the conquest, by a superior kind that would thus elevate the earth to heaven. Right, this is the same identical ideology that underpinned Roman world conquest as God-chosen people. Now, the earliest significant military interactions between Celts and Germans occurred as these migrations intensified. By the 2nd century BC, Germanic tribes had reached the Rhine and the Danube. You understand how sort of slow this movement is. It's not like these peoples couldn't simply pick all their stuff and move even to Central Asia. They actually did. You have the Tocharians, as a matter of fact. It's truly the political and territorial dynamics that did not require, even from a moment to another, any major migration on a regular basis. That's why these peoples were technically not semi-nomadic. We can't call them like that just because at some point they did move, but they were very sedentary in many ways. And most of these clashes occurred because of provincial rivalries, various clans fighting against one another. Again, in a space, especially in between, like the Celts and the Germans in Central Europe, that is not historiographically documented at large, but also would largely reduce or blur, in any case, the boundaries between who was a Celt and who was a German. Even though, again, I'm deeply convinced, of course, that there was, even from their side, they were much more tied to their own tribal and clanic identity and so on, even individual war bands as a point. But they did understand that there were differences, as the same Germanics among each other dwelled in sort of different provinces of their world. And much of these clashes were, again, with Celtic groups in skirmishes and raids. There were also open field confrontations. It's absolutely normal. It's not like everything that is sort of looking as lots of skirmishes and raids excludes pitched battles or stuff like that. Those would have been actually very frequent. The Celts, despite their superior metallurgy, evidenced by iron swords and chainmail found in Latin graves, notoriously. And again, this is just anecdotal information that I throw in for if you literally know zero about them. But again, I have an entire video about Celtic mythology. Were often outmaneuvered by the Germans' cohesive tactics. In some cases, also numerical superiority, even though this concept does not quite hold water. Meaning the Germans were actually many and pushing like to break it, but I mean overall, right? The Celts were much more, at least nominally, what these greater sort of European Celtic establishment, right? That had really a deeper interconnection, like the Celtic road networks connected different centers thousands of kilometers away and so on. Very much that the Germans imported even from those very places. Think about the Ganderstrup cauldron that seems to be very much connected with the Skordisky and the Thracians on the Danube. As a matter of fact, we're in Denmark in that case. And it's a bit like saying that Rome, there is also this nonsense that I've heard only when trying to, again, I never hear this with the Germans at all. There's obviously a reason. I mean, the Celts at some point were largely obliterated by these two peoples. And so there is this sense of, we never talk about them. Like, again, the Romans wrote their propaganda history that obscured how advanced the Celts really were. And there is this notion that the Romans had just soldiers to throw away, as if the Celts were just like Asterix, that you threw in Armorica, you threw legions and legions, and just like they drink the magic potion and they can destroy everybody. If anything, it was the opposite. I mean, I hate to remember that, but to these people, Rome was a city and conquered, again, the overwhelming majority of the people stretching from Ireland to Turkey, and from Portugal to Ukraine. Like, so it's not really, where's the numerical superiority? It's sort of embarrassing, without mentioning that that's also a bit the underrated aspect, and we shall make a bit more videos about Celto-Italic warfare for that matter. Many of, for example, Caesar's legionnaires, as full Roman citizens, as a matter of fact, had a pretty darn consistent amount of Celtic blood, right? As at that point, the major strategic center of what will become Italy was Cisalpine Gaul, right? Many of these were, of course, sons of descended from Italics, but they had also married local women and sort of Celtic and or Celticized populations of those places. And they were, in fact, more warlike in general because they historically were more primitive. It's a bit like, I don't know, later the Illyrians, say, or less developed peoples that had more, like in today's world, like normally the military is composed by people that come from the poorest part of your country. That's always the case, and that was the case as well. And so more brutality, less to lose, right? It's not like the Roman war was very, very peaceful. Right, but surely also it was a bit more peaceful than the Celtic one in this sort of border areas. The Celts' tribal fragmentation with fiercely independent groups like the Boii, Sequani, and Aedui, I made a video also about the latter, frequently warring among themselves, weakened their ability to present a unified front. They could have not united to begin with, right? The Gauls almost succeed by the time of Caesar, but in a way that had already demonstrated their general weakness also to the Germans. And so with Rome, even if Caesar had been defeated, and there's a reason, by the way, why he wasn't, they had just, it was just a matter of time before Rome would conquer the Gauls. And the anecdotes about, if they had united, it was said they would have conquered the world. Well, there is a reason, again, if they didn't. Right, it just was a way of saying, like, look at all these people's warlike. If they united, but it was an hyperbole at the time, from the same Caesar's background. So the words there always remember that if you are also so fixated about Roman propaganda, you have always to actually contextualize Latin literature, thanks to which we know so much about the Celts to begin with and the Germans, given that you're so bothered often by that. And that, like, if you obviously don't know that Roman context, or why, for example, Caesar himself would increase, would favor the image of the Gauls, telling the truth, as essentially people ready for Romanization, so probably also slightly adding a slightly positive tone, just like, I don't know, Tacitus's Germans, regardless of how probably he impoverished them for different reasons, but never also underestimate the brutality and the primitiveness of these populations to begin with, right? Now, these initial wars set the stage for larger, more important military campaigns as the Germans exploited Celtic disunity to expand their influence. The Cimbrian War, 113-101 BC, was the first major military confrontation involving both Celts and Germans. Because today we don't talk just about, again, fighting between the Celts and Germans, but also with the Romans, but also together with the Romans, which did happen as well. Overwhelmingly at large, the Roman Empire also happens because the Celts decide to be under the Romans. And for a very long time, to say the least, and becoming actually in the most developed Celtic areas, some of the finest products of Romanization. Keeping the Germans out, right? It was a top priority, as a matter of fact. If there had been a major sort of demographic push for favoring the Germans, it would have not been a Roman Empire to begin with. And so you must be politically literate to understand history in general. Like, if you don't understand this basic concept, if you think that the world is dominated by the terrible elites that prevent people from making their choices, there isn't really very far you can go, right? Either you accept in the extremes that the Celts did actually largely support Rome, not because they would have liked in absolute terms, but because, they would have ended up pretty badly otherwise. Or you have to accept that they were so weak that Romans could simply control a disproportionately larger amount of peoples just because they were incapable and so not so strong or developed, which also wasn't the case. It's the first picture, the first option is the correct one. The Cimbrian War marked a turning point in Celto-Germanic interaction and exposing at the same time the vulnerabilities of Celtic military structures, because even though, as you know, there were some Celtic groups among the Cimbrians, the Teutons, alongside them, the Ambrons, essentially, when you look at, of course, like the main target of the Germans were largely Celtic areas, including ones already controlled by the Romans, and mostly Gaul, because it was rich and politically fragmented, and so by far the best target for everybody involved. Around 120-115 BC, the Cimbri, likely originating from Jutland, along with the Teutonus and Ambrones, initiated a mass migration, possibly triggered by flooding. Again, there is the debated Cimbrian flood, and again, I'm not going to pronounce myself because I honestly never found this sort of environmentalistic explanations really compelling. People can fuck everything up very well all by themselves. Like, politics is way more important than practically anything that happens from an environmental point of view. Resource scarcity naturally can as well be a thing. I mean, the Germans knew pretty darn well that there was a disproportionately more advanced and richer world out there that they could, in their view, reach and plunder with ease. And in fact, the Cimbrian War shows what they were saying before. If they had really wanted to move, they could do it very quickly, right? Even during the migration era, normally Germanic groups took forever to cross certain territory, not because they couldn't, but because, general international balance was sort of very, very dangerous. And in any case, they could simply remain where they were for a longer time. I also made recently a video about Maximinus' successful campaign in northern Germany, still during the 3rd century crisis. I mean, the myth also that Rome did not control Germania is nonsensical. Obviously, the Romans controlled very well for centuries what laid on the right bank of the Rhine, and they had all the strategic power and projectional capacity to tame them in case of need. Conquering, directly controlling, completely different thing. The Romans reasoned quite pragmatically in cost-benefit ratio, like any other of these peoples. That's why, again, they remained for a long time also in the same condition, right? The Celts largely lived on to become sort of the peoples that we know today in different parts of Europe. Also there, again, who were the Celts? At the root of that is, let's not discuss it, but they were definitely the same peoples whose establishment fought against the Romans and the Germans at that point. Ancient sources like Strabo question themselves at the time environmental causes, so showing that at the time there was already some skepticism about the fact that these were some deterministic reasons. They simply wanted to go out there and conquer, quite simply. Moving southeast, the Cimbrian, this broader coalition, allied with Celtic tribes like the Boii and defeated the Celto-Illyrian Skordiski in the Balkans, as a matter of fact, demonstrating their ability to integrate Celtic warriors into their campaigns, but at least at the detriment of the same broader Celtic war that was becoming ever more dependent on the same Germans. In the same way, if the Germans were stronger, they had the upper hand in a moment, of course, the Celts would also be subjugated in that way. It's exactly what the Romans would do with them from the other side. By 113 BC, the Germans, let's call them the Germans at this point, or the Celto-Germanic Cimbro-Teutons and Bronnens, reached Noricum, home to the Celtic Tauriski, a Roman ally. The Tauriski, unable to repel the invaders with their hill fort-based defenses and cavalry-heavy forces, because they were a rich people, also the best smiths out there, like the Calibus Noricum came from a long time, to the migration era from, in fact, this most advanced metallurgic center in Central Europe, seeking at that point Roman assistance, drawing Rome into a war that would reshape the Celtic war. That obviously tells you how Rome, from the top of her power, de facto controlled these populations on the Alpine Arc and beyond. In 113 BC, the Roman consul Cneius Papirius Carbo led a legionary force, likely numbering 20 to 30,000 men, to Noricum to confront the Cimbri and their allies. Carbo's strategy relied on intimidation, demanding their withdrawal, but his attempt to ambush them at the Battle of Noreia backfired. The Cimbri, with a mixed Germanic, again Celtic force estimated at very large also population, including non-combatants, some say even up to 100, 200,000, it's perhaps a bit too much, but consider in any case that they were very militarized. So basically, virtually almost all the male population among the freemen that they largely were was in arms. That was their deal. So they were moving, famously enough, with their wagons, with their people. There weren't some war bands only, but a bit like the Celts before, they were spearheading this advance to find a place where to stay. It was a mix, actually, between plundering and they would make a big tour of Europe back and forth many times, showing that they were simply living off the land to an extent before settling somewhere at some point, but they had very sort of contingent planning. They didn't know themselves they would have ended up, right? Because it really depended on the political balance. And this force that was, as you understand, manpower-wise very, very strong, overwhelmed Carbo's legions in a chaotic engagement. Right, the Germans massed infantry supported by Celtic cavalry, at least if we are to imagine this as who would use the best of their forces, exploited the Romans' overconfidence and poor terrain management, routing their forces and nearly killing Carbo himself. All right, this aspect is very important because the idea that the Germans, again, were this fresh race, ready to explode in their aggressive warlikeness. And the Romans were ultimately capable of beating them. In this, it would take half of a millennium before they would regain sort of the upper hand themselves, and in a very different situation with much more exhausted forces from both sides. I made lots of videos about migration here in any case. Is quite interesting, and the idea is that this manpower would manifest in the toughness of their infantry charges, of their massed columns, etc. They're not even the Romans. There were also an incredibly vigorous ethnicity, capable again of colonizing essentially the entirety of Western Europe and even molding its language with their own, etc. Were not able to stop. This defeat left Italy itself vulnerable, but the Cimbri, instead of invading, moved west into Gaul. right? They deemed it to be more prudent in the moment, and also because Gaul was just easier to plunder, right? Gaul, as a whole, was a Celtic stronghold under Roman influence already, where the Germans disrupted tribes like the Allobroges and the Volcae. This aspect is quite fascinating for a number of reasons. First of all, the Romans had interiorized from their also mythological past the figure of the Gaul, right, as this giant with red hair and so on. Naturally, most Celts look very different and were actually also very similar to the Italics to an extent. The idea, however, is that there is a two-stage kind of ethnographic interest in the Celts and in the Germans that also align to some extent in relation with Rome, right? But at this point already, Gaul was under Roman sway. There were some of the most powerful tribes were Roman allies, also pretty good ones. And during the same Roman invasion and conquest of Gaul, they will fundamentally side with Rome for most of the time. The Taurisci's reliance on Rome and their subsequent defeat highlighted the Celts' diminishing military autonomy. It's not a good sign when somebody can enter your territory, sack, plunder, you will shut yourself inside the fortified oppida and not have any capacity basically to counterattack at any point, right? And consider the means of the times, like the communications of the time. This is a massive early Germanic host that can move across the entirety of Europe. Again, probably human mobility is one of the single most underrated factor in history, but this is like a massive display of political crisis from the Gallic side. As a consequence, also a Roman one, because Rome was sort of involved in pretty severe issues across the Mediterranean, mostly its own civil strifes and increasing tensions in the way that the system was handled. And so the Germans simply entering her sphere of influence and actually beating the same Roman legions was pretty impressive blow. There was at this point a new fear of the barbarian, of the German in this case. There was truly like this sense, these blonde giants that arrived out of nowhere and that threatened constituted order. Marius obviously emphasized very much that the Romans tended themselves to overrate their adversaries to show like that Rome had this broader divine mandate. And of course, like these were massive, titanic enterprises from both sides, right? But in terms of the actual sort of where would this Cimbri go at the end of the day, look at how it actually ended, right? And so really they were probably less of a threat, generally speaking, than we imagined. They directly threatened Italy, but they didn't even properly enter it, because at least the north was not Italy at large. In 109, the Cimbri invaded instead the Roman province of Gallia Narbonensis. So we are essentially today southwestern France, clashing with the consul Marcus Junius Silanus. At an unspecified battle, Silanus's army, including Celtic auxiliaries, by the way, was defeated, likely due to the Cimbri's numerical advantage and their ability to coordinate, again, arms. The Germans' wedge formations, as described by later sources like Tacitus, allowed them to break Roman lines on this occasion, while Celtic allies provided the skirmishing support, also important amounts of cavalry. We know that by this point, Roman ethnic cavalry had largely sort of gentrified. The Romans preferred basically to entrust the entire cavalry force to the auxilia of other people, probably outside of Italy, including majorly at this point the Celts, but also the Numidians, the Iberians. In any case, it's interesting because it shows Rome's confidence. Also later times when there were as many auxiliaries as Roman legionaries, and even in major operations at the fringes of the world, that their military, their core of Roman heavy infantry was alone able just to agglutinate this other auxilia and to beat other peoples. In 107, the Tigurini, that were a Celtic tribe allied with the Cimbri, ambushed a Roman army under Lucius Cassius Longinus Ravalla at Burdigala, that is modern Bordeaux, on the Atlantic. The Tigurin's rapid cavalry charges and javelin volleys, combined with Germanic infantry support, overwhelmed the Romans, killing the consul and enslaving survivors. This victory underscored the effectiveness of combined Germanic-Celtic tactics with the Germans' disciplined formations, complementing the Celts' aggressive mobile warfare, to add a bit of, again, of archetype or stereotype if you prefer. Because it's true that the Germans didn't really have much cavalry to begin with. They mostly began to develop any sort of relevant forces that would be able to cope with the same Iranics or the Romans just later in history. These Germans had something like that, but from the Jutland, from Scandinavia, from which these peoples originated at this point in history, like there probably wasn't, but it was just like sheer will. And again, this cohesive compactness of the various tribes during the expedition would make it. It's essentially a struggle between moral forces, not this or that tactic. Actually, again, they looked all pretty similar to a modern eye, had we had the chance to sort of videotaping. Now, the climax of these early disasters came at the Battle of Arausio. That was actually the bloodiest defeat Rome ever suffered, like even more than Cannae. At least if we stick to the numbers that may easily be inflated in general, also for Cannae. But from both, sort of, we'll explain better this in our terms. I mean, there is no need to have 20 or 30,000 men more or less in the account for those battles to be morally, politically, historically impacting. All right, it's all mostly like a broader sense of how these powers related with one another through these encounters that were in any case quite big by scale, and being big about numbers, say just fixating of look, the source said this, so it must be it, like this sort of this paste and copy of primary sources quotes, and so I was saying, this is actual history. That's actually the first indicator of how much of a non-expert you actually are. Like the incapacity of understanding history is about the critical inquiry of sources, not copying what the sources say and dispatching it as a matter of truth. All right. Again, everything, by the way, aligns largely with the broader picture, right? The consuls Gnaeus Mallius Maximus and Quintus Servilius Caepio commanded a combined force of allegedly over 80,000 men, including 40,000 legionnaires, 20,000 auxiliaries, many Celtic, and camp followers to confront the Cimbrian Teutones near the Rhone River. Internal rivalry led to a divided command, which was essentially the main cause of the defeat. It's not like the Roman military was sort of less advanced than the Germanic foes, but it doesn't quite matter because, again, war is asymmetric by definition, and the odds can shift, especially when such large forces are involved. With Caepio encamped on one side of the river, Rhone, and Maximus on the other, undermining coordination. Caepio, seeking glory, launched a premature attack without Maximus's support, engaging the Germanic-Celtic coalition, estimated at, again, we don't know the numbers, because if you say that the Romans were 80,000, and that this Cimbri and Teutones more than them, like what they were, 100,000, 150,000, so you understand that at least probably the fighting force from both sides was much smaller, but still incredibly big for the time, and that's what matters at the end of the day, and as much as the outcome. In fact, the Cimbri and Teutones deploying massed infantry in these deep formations, designed properly to push, all right, it's something that the Romans themselves had historically done. Think about the same Cannae being trapped in trouble with that. Naturally, these Celto-Germanic armies, as we explained before, were less wieldy. They hadn't achieved a level of tactical development comparable to essentially Hannibalic and Scipionic school of military art. But as we've seen, with adequate and pretty standard, also like almost obliged kind of arrays and tactical distribution, annihilated Caepio's army, exploiting his exposed position. Maximus's forces, caught unprepared across the river, were subsequently routed in a second engagement. Roman sources themselves estimate from 60 to 80,000 casualties, a a loss rivalry, actually surpassing Cannae. If we have, again, to stick just to numbers for how they're given to us, naturally, for all these battles, we will make probably the primary sources battle analysis at some point. I'm trying to get a little bit back to our lottery / cycle that always amazed us, and I don't know how much of a difference you perceived here in topics choices, but it's a mix of different sort of topics choices. The Germanic Celtic coalitions' success stemmed from their ability to exploit Roman disunity in terrain, with the German tactics probably benefiting even from as we've seen, this Celtic contribution in some sort of infantry cavalry stereotypical fashion. It's mostly like the German push of deep formation against the equally probably deep Roman ones, because again, now there is no need to make a story of the Roman army and how sort of deeper Roman and the more homogeneous, flexible Roman armies had become at this point. So the Germans themselves understood that aside from the obvious play of cavalry on the flanks from both sides, there had to be in the center some pretty consistent infantry deployment, right? And they were sort of the better people at that point to cope with the Romans in terms of infantry depth, right? You don't find another point. This is very interesting because in later times the Germans were brutally defeated by Caesar, also with the raid into Germania, we'll see now. And so basically the Romans conquered Germany. Like the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was just like sort of an accident with enormous consequences, as we very well know, politically and strategically. But literally, like the Romans at that point had passed from the Cimbrian Wars, as we will see the outcome of them now, this Germanic fear, right? And they had actually conquered Germany, especially the west part of it, considering these peoples as very sort of inept from a military point of view. They mostly feared the Marcomanni that had basically taken the place of the Boii, by the way, in fact, what is today's Bohemia, so taking the name after them. Now, instead of marching on Rome, the Cimbri moved to Hispania at this point, showing again that even after this massive Roman bloodbath, realistically, it's not like you simply entered Italy and the Romans sitting there and you sort of simply plunder and coming back. That was not a thing. That's where they faced the defeat by a Celtiberian coalition, while the Cimbri, the Teutones remain in Gaul, further destabilizing Celtic tribes. At this point, they were sort of kind of relaxing, saying, okay, we beat the Romans in Gaul. We can sort of indulge in sacking, etc. They split, and the Celtiberians in the north, also Iberia actually suffered heavy damage from the Teutons, but they're also rough people up there, especially in the north where the mountains is very difficult ground. It's a sort of Roncesvalles, right? Ante litteram. And in particular, the Arausio disaster, dubbed the Terror Cimbricus, as a matter of fact, prompted Rome to appoint Gaius Marius as consul for 5 consecutive terms from 104 BC. I made a video about Marius in this instance. It was not much about it was a video talking also about the Cimbrian War, or wars if you prefer. But it was mostly talking about Marius's, not even reform. Yeah, I made a video also about Marian reform for that matter if you're interested, but mostly about some issues with his soldiers, certain religious worldviews, sort of some propaganda, some ideologism stemming from the Popularis background, that is the Magna Mater of Picinus and so on. So if you're interested, you can check that out. Marius really never made a video about him, but obviously what we're talking about, leveraging his reputation from the Jugurthine War, reformed the Roman military that basically witnessed this standardization in equipment that had already largely happened, but derived obviously from the abolition of the classes of census as far as recruitment standards were concerned. the model around which like the Roman legionary had basically concretized at this point was the one of the princeps, right? So you have basically the pila, so different javelin, one for the shorter. They had to be thrown in succession. We'll make a video about pila uses as well. Like one for the longer range was lighter, and one for the closer range in quick succession, mostly thrown in attack. There are instances in which also Caesar used them, by the way, in defense. The gladius, the short thrusting sword, and for the rest, again, essentially the same chainmail armor from Celtic inheritance, so to say, the rugged scutum and so on. This stuff was around for quite a while. Telling the truth, we don't even know whether the Marian reforms literally homogenized the various Roman cohorts and maniples, including maniples still existing throughout the early empire. We know it well. Probably there was a certification of that kind. So they were literally all alike. It's mostly how they collectively interacted. In fact, they were becoming increasingly more professional, including their NCO cadres, etc. If anything, morale, sort of training, discipline more than else, were increasing. Rome was becoming much more subtly controlled by some major gentes, as you know, and so everything was also heavily funded by private assets, etc., for political purpose. Marius raised a new army of approximately 30,000 Romans and 40,000 Italian and Celtic allies, fortifying positions around Aquae Sextiae, modern Aix-en-Provence. His reforms, though again debated, as we were alluding to, by modern historians, likely enhanced legionary cohesion, introducing the cohort system and improving logistical support, critical for countering the Germanic threat. Mostly was a great general, very experienced, with some already veterans that were de facto already professional troops as a consequence. But again, this had started since the Second Punic War, even before, depending on how you want to see this going. I made multiple videos about cohortal tactics and organization. If you care about understanding why that specific army had formed, like you can find a sort of quick answer there, but we will always come back on the topic. It's very interesting. Spain had been the theater where that had mostly been needed. Now, in 102, the Cimbrian Teutonists planned a two-pronged invasion of Italy. Right, this was the boldest move, and as you know, I don't want to spoil things before time, but it did not end well. The Teutonists, Ambrones and Tigurini, advanced west along the coast from Transalpine to Cisalpine Gaul, so they crossed the Alps, while the Cimbri took the eastern route through the Julian and Carnic Alps. So basically, they were coming from the different ends of the Alpine arc, and that tells you how much sway they held north of the Alps in general, across the Celtic border, right? Marius positioned his forces at the confluence of the Isère and Rhône rivers to intercept the Teutonists, estimated at 50 to 100,000, including non-combatants, obviously. When they arrived, they taunted Marius's entrenched army, attempting to provoke a battle. Marius, employing a Fabian strategy of avoiding premature engagement, maintained high ground, frustrating the Teutonists that naturally had difficulties instead, for example, maintaining order on tougher ground more than the Romans would have had. But it was just like overall, in absolute terms, a strong strategic position. Like it was the Cimbri, if anything, that were invading, and so had the strategic initiative. The Romans stood in between and said, come and get us. According to Plutarch, the Germanic vast numbers took 6 days to pass Marius's camp, a testament to their scale. Marius trailed them, exploiting a tactical error when the Ambrones, that would have been, by the way, probably the Celts of the situation, camped separately. In a swift night ambush, his legions crushed the Ambrones, killing or capturing thousands and disrupting the Teutonic coalition's cohesion. The Battle of Aquae Sextiae followed, a masterclass in Roman tactical adaptation. Marius positioned his 30,000 to 40,000 men on elevated terrain, concealing 5 cohorts, approximately 2,500 men, under Claudius Marcellus in a nearby wood. The Teutones and their allies, likely numbering 40 to 60,000 warriors, even though, again, probably both forces were smaller. Right? For the record, anything bigger than 50,000 at this point, tactically controlled in a single battle, is basically nonsensical. It's even more like, had it even been possible to amass them, like impossible to control, right? So we can't think 40,000, but it's likely, again, these forces were, already had they been 30,000 warriors, would have been a big deal for the times and places, in any case, also for the Romans. And they attacked uphill, relying on massed infantry charges, so still investing basically on the strongest thing they had, because they couldn't really do much else there. And again, it's all very strategically sound, after all. Don't think to be like, oh, these guys lost, so they were dumb. No, that's not how warfare works in practice. Marius's legions absorbed the assault, that was ferocious, by the way, using pilum volleys to disrupt enemy formations, followed by gladius-based close combat. The Germans, telling the truth, had very similar warfare. Like, everybody in Europe used javelins before the charge, etc. So even in here, like, the Romans are famous because of pilums, but where did their superiority lay? In technical stuff, in material? That it was essentially a moral thing. These guys literally fought, like, ripping each other's guts off to get it over with, right? Marcellus's hidden corps at this point struck the enemy's rear, triggering a rout. It was a great masterclass, because any sort of concealed ambush party is always the fruit of sort of very good command and coup d'oeil from the side also the party's commander, not just much like the guy who's in charge of the main body. The Teutones were massacred, with their king Teutobod captured. Roman sources claim 100,000 casualties, likely exaggerated, and reported Teutonic women, famously enough, facing enslavement, committed mass suicide with their children, a grim reflection of their resolve. As we explained before, the entire purpose of these people was conquering other peoples. So being conquered was the end. It meant they had failed, and so they did not deserve to leave. And if anything, self-sacrifice was sort of a higher way of going than the humiliation of slavery, of rape, etc. So it's absolutely realistic, by the way, and there are many depictions, as you know, in the ancient world, of showing, especially the Celts, committing suicide with their families, and or also on the battlefield when the situation was low. I mean, Roman high command, like other peoples, like they did that if they screwed up. Like, it was still a moment in which people had those massive attributes to literally understand that they were done for, and so it was better to go in a dignified way. This victory eliminated the Teutonic threat, but the Cimbri remained a formidable force. In 101, the Cimbri breached the Alpine passes, which Marius's co-consul Quintus Lutatius Catulus failed to fortify, allowing them to ravage northern Italy. Catulus, with 20 to 30,000 men, withdrew behind the Po River, ceding the region de facto. Marius, fresh from Aquae Sextiae, joined Catulus with his battle-hardened legions, forming a combined force of approximately 50,000, probably again less. And at the Battle of Vercellae on the Raudine Plain near the Sesia and Po rivers, Marius deployed his army. The point was to absorb this frontal hits, like sort of deep breakthrough attempts, right? And the Cimbri from the other side, in fact, used the habitual tactic, led by Boiorix, forming a massive phalanx, reportedly a square with 30 men on each side. That, again, it's unlikely. They would have been wider than deeper, but still depth mattered for the push, right? For pushing, especially among infantrymen. You can't do that with cavalry, for that matter. But their reliance on infantry left them vulnerable to Roman mobility. In fact, Marius's cavalry, including Celtic auxiliaries, outmaneuvered the Cimbri, while his legions disrupted their formation with pilum barrages, gladius charges as always. A dust storm, possibly exacerbated by Roman tactics, disoriented the Cimbri, leading to their annihilation. We're making things very simple for the sake of not much of time, but again, these are all better analyzed. We're here just sticking to anecdotes in general, the conjectures, even how overall things may have really gone, but there is all a proper sort of sourcing that will make in reconstructing the various battles. Boiorix and Lugius were killed, and Roman sources claim over 100,000 Cimbrian casualties. As at Aquae Sextiae, many Cimbrian women reportedly killed themselves and their children to avoid capture. The victory ended the Cimbrian War, securing Italy and elevating Marius' status, though it fueled his rivalry with Sulla, foreshadowing Rome's civil wars. Right. The Cimbrian War had profound military implications for the Celts, as we explained before, and here also for the Romans to a degree, because it was a moment of sort of stepping up, of sort of a demonstration that Marius' reforms were insightful. They had sort of given the chance to many dispossessed to properly win, right, some of their next possessions in arms and to sort of live as heroes, like having defeated this barbarian threat. So everything is baked with Roman politics, the way the Germans were represented. Now, since we're talking mostly about the Celts here, like the Germanic migrations disrupted Celtic territories, as we've seen in Noricum, in Gaul, weakening their military cohesion. This had been essentially the most advanced parts of the Celtic world, and they had been gradually undermined by such events. Right? These are relatively fragile systems in pre-industrial society. Like if you have somebody passing by and raiding, plundering, so it's not really something you can immediately recover from. And the Germans, as a mass of people, are always there, looming as a threat. And that's where, in fact, it's understood that Rome has this greater mission to fundamentally defend the sort of the meek and sort of punishing the bold, right? So to say. And the Tauriscians' reliance on Rome and their defeat at Noreia exposed their further vulnerability. Rome had not really needed to go conquer these places. They were already within her orbit, as we explained also in the video about the Iberian Wars. Rome, up to Caesar, fundamentally did not really have a real continental interest in broader terms. The Mediterranean, in many ways, was enough to control a disproportionate amount of wealth already that also would make this outer population sort of gravitate around you to begin with. But the Germanic expansion was, at this point, a threat to a much bigger systems that the Romans, in this sense, already controlled, right? There had been different outcomes in here. For example, tribes like the Tigurini, despite temporary alliances with the Germans, were marginalized, proving that many Celts were just siding with the Germans because they were obliged by the circumstances, taking advantage of the situation with a very short, medium-term perspective, for which they knew that revenge from multiple sides could come. The war highlighted the Celts' tactical weaknesses. Their reliance on individual bravery in cavalry, while effective in skirmishes, falter against Germans' cooperative formations and the Romans' disciplined legions as well. Because as we've seen, the Celts had unsurprisingly fought from both sides. And that would be better understood. This was probably, and I don't know how much today, but it seems to me also historiographically probably one of the most underrated aspects of it all. Mostly because we don't have a Celtic voice in all of this. At least not a Germanic one either, right? But at least the conceptualization of the Germans as the next sort of protagonist in European history, together with Rome and so on, has historiographically driven a bit more attention or even sympathy towards the Germans. Whereas we look at these peoples that eventually were conquered by the Romans and eventually became Roman Empire, and at least in our eyes, they disappeared, but they were still there, and they did contribute dramatically. So as far as the eventual Roman expansion was concerned, they didn't open gates to Rome only, at least because that happened too, but they essentially were striving to maintain independence. At some point, they were
put in front of the choice of which model do we want to live in, right? The Germanic world was really more primitive and isolated than the Celtic one at this point. So that it was obvious that Rome would have the upper hand, also in terms of the aforementioned choice, given also the higher living standards of the Celts, that, however, could not put together enough force to withstand the Germans alone. Germanic warriors, as described in, there are big names in historiography, archaic, if you want, like Theodor Mommsen, we're told, adopted the Celtic style, iron and copper alloy helmets and long swords, but retained their sort of fundamental type. We don't see any major military step up, right, during this period. There is a bit more of privatization of sort of elite oligarchy managing, especially in Gaul, and increasingly professionalized set of picked war bands, stuff like that. But again, there is nothing structural changing across the Celtic world during the crisis. And obviously, it's not like there is a military system that emerged even in the wars with Rome. There weren't the resources to have it, right? They probably didn't have that background. As we've seen, the same Germans had basically won across Europe through sheer will and manpower. So something very basic as effective in its primitive and moral kind. The Germans had been, however, toughened up by the experience themselves. I mean, this broader invasion of the rest of Europe had surely provided them with a better insight of the Mediterranean, of their military capacities and limits, right? They, at this point, were likely Celticized more in arms and armor. What we see again in the early Germanic military identity is something that largely you see also in Roman arms and armor. This overwhelming Celtic influence. And it happens also in other times in history that you have, again, in the case of the Celts, they were advanced to an important degree, but again, they developed arms and armor mostly because they were a warlike people, mostly because they were tribes and they were not as developed as other civilizations in general. The Greeks, the Romans had produced their own very fine arms and armor on their own, so we shouldn't overly exaggerate, as we said before, both for Rome and the Germans, saying they took their weapons from the Celts. If anything, it's a bit truer for the Germans paradoxically in absolute terms. I mean, in relative terms compared to their level of development. The Romans mostly integrated certain designs and in their arms and armor production, probably without even sort of rationalizing that much what kind of weapon standards that had to be properly out there. Because when you talk about the standardization of the Roman army, also during the Marian period, as you know, it's just a form of standard sticking to the essentials we were talking about before. Every soldier had to be mostly equipped in the same way, in the medium average European warrior standard, right? A bit, if anything, better equipped because of Roman wealth and so on, but essentially there could be huge varieties in style, in traditions. There would be other peoples that gave the Romans arms and armor. This happened also with the Celts themselves. I mean, all the arms and armor that Caesar describes in the Commentario Bello Gallico being confiscated by the Romans from those Gallic oppida were really many, right? So you understand why the Roman legionaries at that point fighting in Gaul, also very much relying on local resources, because the Pope had, more often than not, given the senatorial limitations of Caesar's own recruitment, were not such a brilliant base of operation just per se. Even there, the Cisalpine Gauls, that if anything, the Romano-Italic legionnaires recruited from there, were mostly counting on their own moral force, right? that region will remain truly the tip of the balance of Roman strategy also during the civil wars for a reason, because Roman manpower for generations and generations rested in there. By the 1st century BC, Julius Caesar documented the westward push of Germanic tribes across the Rhine. That seemed evidently the most advantageous comeback. Orientatively, Gaul, again, was still rich and politically divided. The key name we remember before is Ariovistus, king among the many of the Suebi. Right, I will surely make a video about Suebi at some point because they're really worthy of our attention. This was a great confederacy, right? It would last up to the mid-2nd century AD, right? Many people, so the later ones, think about the Longobardi, would be under them. These were essentially mostly Elbe Germans, right? But many of them, in fact, came straight from Northern Europe through migrations from there. Now, before 60 BC, Ariovistus allied with the Celtic Sequani against the Aedui. So essentially, the Gauls were taking side against one another, backed by the Germans, or better, the Germans wanted to enter Gaul, and some Gallic tribes exploited the situation accordingly. There's the Battle of Magetobriga in 63, roughly. And the Sequani's Germanic allies deploying their own, again, good cavalry infantry overwhelmed the Aedui cavalry-heavy forces, because the Aedui were basically the top Gauls, also the greatest allies of Rome, securing victory and establishing Ariovistus's dominance in eastern Gaul. This is the Germanic footstep into Gaul proper. That basically meant up to the Rhine, because that's how far Gaul historically extended. Even though, again, in between there were lots of Celto-Germanic people, such as, the Treveri, Semili. Ariovistus's growing influence, so we have explained what the etymology of this guy is. We will never know what his real name was, but Ariovistus meant properly the noble who has a providential capacity to mold, in fact, the universe in his own image through conquest, as we've seen metaphysically in the series about the Indo-European theology. Ariovistus's growing influence, bolstered by increasing Germanic settlers, alarmed Rome, prompting Caesar's intervention. In 58 BC, at the Battle of the Vosges, Caesar faced Ariovistus's coalition of Suebi and allied Celts, estimated at several tens of thousands, probably again less, deploying 6 legions, approximately 30,000 men. Caesar outmaneuvered the Germans, who formed a defensive line fortified by wagons. Also, in this instance, the Romans adopted sort of deep formations. It was important to withstand the Germanic charges that were, however, disrupted by pilum barrages, that sort of Roman discipline, cold blood under pressure. For not talking about cavalry warfare, again, there was Celto-Roman cavalry at this point, helping breaking Germanic ranks and routing them across the Rhine. This victory reinforced the Rhine as Rome's frontier, but also subordinated Celtic tribes like the Aedui to Roman control, diminishing their military autonomy. Caesar's Gallic wars further illustrate the complex military interplay between Celts and Germans. While primarily targeting Celtic tribes, Caesar's campaigns revealed their declining military independence. In 58 BC, he crushed the Helvetes migration at the Battle of Bibracte, where 30 to 40,000 Roman and allied forces faced, allegedly, some tens of thousands Helveti, or Helveti if you prefer. The Celts' initial charge was repelled by Roman discipline, and there is also an interesting level of fortificatory approach. This role, remember that Roman legionaries were primarily assault engineers, right? And the Romans hold their ground, leading to this Celto-Germanic route. Caesar also confronted Germanic tribes, as you know, during the repression of the their incursions across the Rhine. The point is, just like with Britain, as a matter of fact, was to truly terrorize, like to use deterrence in what will turn out to be an incredibly successful way for not having these peoples interfere in Gallic affairs. The Tencteri and the Usipetes were sort of brutally blooded by this Caesar crossing the Rhine near Nijmegen in 55, basically giving this incredible display of military engineering. Like the bridge on the Rhine is one of the greatest feats in the history of military engineering, built in wood in 10 days, allegedly. Caesar pursued these peoples with 40,000 men, feigning negotiations before launching a surprise attack. His legions massacred the Germanic forces, including non-combatants. In a controversial campaign, it was criticized by the Roman Senate, but effective in deterring further crossings. This was actually like the crystal clear Roman pragmatism. These operations highlight the Celts' subordination to Rome and their vulnerability to Germanic incursions as well. Caesar's accounts detail the military contrast between the Celts and the Germans as well. As you know, he had a very ethnographic look. He was one of the most educated and cultured people in his own time, incredible talent, not just in literature, but in poetry more specifically. Celtic warriors, led by nobles, excelled in cavalry. Their infantry instead was fundamentally scarce, right? They used large shields, but they struggled with weapon durability, requiring mid-battle training. This is also like a bit of an incredibly debated point. I will not enter it because some of these words were banned during certain ritual sacrifice, etc. But obviously, iron variety dramatically widened as deep as social ladder went, right? Germanic warriors fought in these tight, wedge-shaped formations, using diaphragm and shields, with terrifying war cry, later known as barritos, to intimidate foes. The Romans technically used that as well, telling the truth, even in this earlier time. Just the point was doing it at the last moment, so to concentrate on the shock effect. The Germans had cavalry. Their horses were apparently small and ugly, so not particularly well suited for confrontation with sort of more developed cavalry forces, but that's where also Caesar lent his own Roman knights, equites, as mounts to the Germans to beat the Celts in combat on multiple occasions. So actually, Caesar did fight with Germanic auxiliaries during the campaign like that. Germans were simply more combative in a broader sense, so it didn't even matter whether they were habituated to this or that horse, they knew how to fight. The Germans, egalitarian or tendentially egalitarian, at least by Celtic standards, for example, social structure that was due mostly to very scarce surplus, and so lack of any dramatic social difference that, however, fostered greater cohesion. With elected chieftains, their aristocracies were very powerful, and don't get me wrong here. They already controlled many quote-unquote freemen or whatever, but in general, it was at some greater collective cohesion, as we explained. From a political standpoint, they fostered unity unlike the Celts' hierarchical and fractious tribes, giving them a strategic advantage in prolonged campaigns. So there is this very interesting aspect of Germanic warfare that is joining with war bands, right? Major expeditions, so that even if the Germanic tribes were actually more fragmented than the Gallic ones, they had a capacity to concentrate forces in very specific instances. We've seen it again during the Cimbrian invasion, exactly based on this shared sense of sort of aptness to warfare, greater militarization across the population, and such. The Germanic migrations continued to reshape the military landscape. Here, I don't know exactly where I should stop because the history actually is very long, it goes on. We're talking more about sort of the centuries before Christ, but even at the turn of the year around 9 BC, the Marcomanni under Maroboduus, a very interesting figure, migrated from the Main Valley to Bohemia, displacing the Celtic boy and subjugating other tribes. And interestingly enough, in Roman accounts, the Marcomanni were a feared power, right? The Romans observed that his forces were modeled on the same Roman legions, which doesn't mean that they fought as the Romans, but they're not even the last Germanic tribe that tells that sort of some Germans at some point adopted some Roman discipline, at least for their own context, and so that they were quite experienced in warfare. They had this greater sort of emphasis on training, on discipline, depending on who they were. And especially the Marcomanni had strong cavalry forces, like in this more southeastern part of Germania Magna, that had historically been actually a Celtic place. Cavalry, because basically the steps begin there, right? We've studied these regions also in other historical times, were stronger, right? And it also showed, by the way, probably that the Germans, the Marcomanni in this case, had adopted the local Celtic surplus of what remained of it to have, in fact, this greater mounted force. It was significantly disturbing. It was sent 4,000 cavalry, several tens of thousands of infantry. Then these numbers are thrown a bit like this, but it's the proportion that matters. And the Danubian Valley was an object of raids. Here we haven't talked about the Dacians that had also contributed to the destruction of the Celts around that part of the Danube. It's, however, an increasingly pressured area, mostly because of this southward expansion of the Germans. The Marcomannic defeat by the Cherusci under Arminius in 17 AD prevented a Germanic monarchy, but did not halt Germanic expansion. By the way, the Marcomanni, as you know, are also seen in action in later times, so they didn't disappear simply. I made last year a very sort of short introduction to all the various Germanic tribes, histories or mini summary for all of them. So if you're interested, you can check that out. I will post it in the top fix comment down below. We'll talk more about early Germanic warfare, probably from their own perspective, because this video is just like a Celto-Germanic focused one, but sort of, I hate the term perspective, by the way, because warfare is always mutual in that sense. There are laws of reciprocity. You can't ever study people without other. But an all sort of early Germanic warfare video is important to just present this other population. And as you know, like even before that, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, when Arminius ambushed 3 Roman legions, approximately 15,000 men under Vinctilius Varus, was a defining Germanic victory. Probably more for also later historiographic, political, national reasons that was really at the time, right? There is, and I don't agree really with this latter aspect, but Tacitus is at some point suspected of having sort of magnified the impact of the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, because the bottom line is that belonging to the senatorial aristocracy that did not want this extension of citizenship to barbarian peoples, and the conquest of Germany would have instead sort of opened to that also for the region, would basically say that the Germans were some primitives, that wasn't much wealth there, that, look at how badly the Romans were beaten, do not go there, it's too much. I don't agree with, say, the criticism of Tacitus, because most of what he says is fundamentally correct about the Germans. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest was really important in general. We really have to come there at some point and reconstructing the same. It's a very interesting battle, by the way. And for its complexity, if anything. Also in terms of political context, we've seen here the rise of Arminius that almost wanted to sort of rally all the Germans. There is this clash against the same Maribod, interestingly enough. So there is there a moment of resurgence even of these Western Germanic peoples in this quite swinging relation with Rome that in any case will always control them at the end of the day, not just because of Germanicus coming back or anything, but the will not enter there because we don't have the Celts, even though we will understand that they were there as well from the Roman side. Using guerrilla tactics in dense forests, the Cherusci on that occasion, as you know, had lured the Romans into a trap, exploiting their overextension and poor scouting. There is all a sense of, again, like of incumbent doom, but even under pressure and ultimately massacred, the Roman legionnaires showed dramatic discipline and capacity. The Germans also from the other side with fortifications, with fallen trees, various obstacles to prevent like the Roman crossing of the forest. So over 3 days, the Germans annihilated the legions, killing Varus and halting Roman expansion east of the Rhine. Right, this was decided in a broader sense. It had already been essentially eyeballed by Caesar, and Augustus at this point, says, we have to essentially back down for direct conquest, right? But that had already started, was underway in many ways. The Germans got importantly Romanized in the following centuries. And so, I don't know, ending with the Battle of Teutoburg IV is the saying, like, look at this expansion of the Germans from the other side. The Romans take over the Celtic world, expand into Germania, but also because of the Illyrian revolt, the army of Varus was meant to create a pincer movement. From the other side, you had Tiberius on the Danube against the Marcomanni. These West Germans, nobody really cared very much about because they had been easily conquered. But in any case, the victory emboldened the Germanic tribes, intensifying pressure on Celtic territories and reinforcing the Rhine as a military frontier. Here, we could go on by talking, obviously, about, the 3rd century, the Germanic confederacies like the Franks, the Alemanni, and the Burgundians, but they don't have much connection with the Celts other than essentially occupying former Celtic regions after sort of their breakthrough also in the later centuries. The Alemanni were a coalition of tribes repeatedly raiding Roman Gaul, defeating Celto-Roman forces at battles like Mediolanum in 259, where their fast-moving infantry and cavalry overwhelmed Roman defenses. The Franks consolidating in northeastern Gaul. I recently made a video about early Frankish warfare clashing with Romanized Celts, absorbing or displacing them in campaigns along the Rhine. The Goths, Gepidae, and Vandals migrating southeast, controlling regions like Ukraine and Romania by the 3rd century, further marginalizing Celtic remnants that had been there. And you feel sorry a bit for these relics, in fact, of Celtic world, that by that point we don't even understand how truly Celtic they would have understood themselves between the Dacians, the Sarmatians, and so on. And the same Germans. Archaeological evidence, such as Jastorf-style weapons and settlements replacing Latin artifacts in southern Germany, confirms this shift. The Germans, again, tended to follow the Danube, like from the left bank, descending mostly towards, again, the Pontic steppe. They couldn't simply break through the Celto-Roman world that easily for centuries and centuries, and they mostly work as sort of client states within the sphere of Rome, providing, by the way, with auxiliaries themselves, not just in the areas, those sort of areas of Germanic or Celto-Germanic identity along the Rhine, right, but having entire Germanic groups serving for Rome, right? It would be interesting to observe in other videos how Celtic military traditions persisted within the Roman Empire, with warriors serving as auxiliaries in campaigns against Germanic tribes, and in this sense sort of paying back a little bit for all the vexations of the former times, and now with properly Gallo-Roman elites framed within an imperial establishment. And it's not like at the beginning, say, auxiliaries were particularly necessarily uniformed like Roman troops. As a matter of fact, in certain cases, they could even be better equipped by the same Romans. But most of these peoples followed their own ethnic specialties that eventually diluted themselves towards the later empire, right? As Roman population became sort of less militarized as it had been in these tribal times back in the day. In any case, these efforts were under Roman command, reflecting the Celts' loss of independent military power. The Latin culture, once dominant, was overtaken by Germanic material culture in Central Europe, as seen in Bohemia and southern Germany. The migration era cemented Germanic military dominance. Also, the Hunnic arrival in the last quarter of the 4th century triggered further Germanic movements with the Visigothic sack of Rome in 410 and establishing kingdoms in Spain, defeating essentially Roman Celtic forces, if you want. When you think about the Illyrians, for example, back in the day, historically we say they are Illyrians. Why? Because they were actually Illyrian ethnically. Largely, those were provinces occupied by the Celts historically, such as the Skordiski. It's true that they had been displaced from centuries, but you can argue that many people, including, again, those that descended from the Celts that had followed the course of the Danube in their migrations, had remained there, right? And so there were lots of Celtic auxiliaries. For example, in the Notizia Dignitatis, we know in the army of Julianus, etc., many of them came also from the Celtic fringe, what had remained of sort of independent Celtic rule. They will resist, sort of historically, in many ways, but in a marginal sense. The fact, however, that the word this Celtic identity is still in late antiquity is remarkable, because it shows that, in general, like, those peoples had existed for centuries or even millennia with, let's leave aside the term Celtic, but let's say with their own local identity, provincial pride, etc. Think about the empire of the Gauls, right? That didn't have, unlike the Palmyrene Empire, any secessionistic pulsion, but they just were saying, this is the Gallo-Roman establishment who wants to protect the Rhine from Germanic attacks. So you can see there actually an interesting continuity here, and there are interesting consequences here. While the Vandals conquered North Africa, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes invaded Britain. So battling Romanized Celts and forming Anglo-Saxon kingdoms through campaigns like the Battle of Badon at the beginning of the 6th century, where Celtic resistance under figures like Arthur, if historical, temporarily stalled Germanic advances. The mere fact that an Arthurian legion survived and that historically it even blossomed in later times during the High Middle Ages speaks of a specific Celtic identity that it's not much that hadn't been erased by the Romans, because it wasn't meant to be. Like, many people try also to detract the Roman Empire by saying, it flattened everything, whatever. It was simply like the local peoples that gradually Romanized. It's not like the Romans were sort of trying to teach Latin at the tip of their swords. Like, it's simply something that happened by itself, and largely the same peoples that inhabited there remained there. There were injections, of Italic colonists of Germanic tribesmen later, but at large, right, whatever these Celts ethnogenetically had been about, the previous populations before the Indo-European conquest, whatever, it does not even matter so much now. Politically, identically, in historical times, the Celts were there, even though we lack these specific explicit indicators. And again, I can't stress enough how it happens. It strikes me because every once in a while I make this kind of videos, and you have, but not even in them, like comments like saying, "Oh, can you explain to us how the Celts united with the Germans during the migration era to dislodge the Romans from places like, I don't know, Gaul or Spain?" That did not happen, right? If we're talking about Celto-Germanic piracy in the North Sea, that's something. But in general, like we have people that want to be told that, I don't know, the Gallo-Romans were siding with the Germans against Rome. That didn't happen, all right? Also because, again, what existed in Gaul was very much worth of, admiration from every part of the empire, and definitely a Germanic conquest, if avoidable, would have been preferred. At some point, the Germans are accepted mostly by the single most Roman peoples that existed in the West, as opposed to the Byzantines in the East, and at large, the West remained Romance, and while informed by Germanic rule, definitely not in an imperial sense. Like they were basically like few points percentage of the millions of Roman population that essentially blended in the following couple of generations, also marrying to the local elites. So this angst and Hass, where, I don't know, everybody wants to destroy Rome, but why don't we appreciate that Rome built up these peoples to begin with, and that there is no historical way to even pretend to deny the macroscopical evidence of this phenomenon, and everybody for nationalistic reasons, so post-traditional, because nationalism has nothing to do with traditional understanding of nation that is much more transcendental and elevated for that very reason, has to do. Like today's people do not know history. Probably they're not exposed to any trace of history, not in school, nor in family, zero, right? We have people who think that, I don't know, they know history because they come from one place, and they know the history of the place for that reason, without any trace of education. That's a mental illness. I don't know, that there should be psychiatric asylums dedicated to these specific issues. This is the proof of, in fact, the collapse of a civilization. When people, not just lesser people, those who are supposed to be average people, that are still lesser people anyway, but in any case, start thinking this, you understand there's a brain rot that affects the entire society. It's unsurprising that these ideas come around, not to fix the system, as a consequence of the fact that the system is broken. Right? And on Schwerpunkt, we try to show you the obvious. I mean, that's the thing that strikes me also about YouTube videos, that they filtered a specific worldview seeking to essentially enable moral relativism as historical objectivism. Say, looking at minutiae a little bit like in hyper-specialization and distracting people from the bigger picture. People should be taught the bigger picture in cubital characters and then passing to the depths of it, right? You should do both at the same time, ideally, but in general, right? The fact that we have to explain these things to supposedly fully developed adult people is a major red flag in terms of the quality of the latter as human beings, if we can so call them. When, in any case, we look at, for example, the fall of Soissons, this dominion ruled by Syagrius, we just talked recently about early Merovingian warfare, when in 486, you realize that there were Celtic remnants together with Roman forces there. There was still some blame. I mean, at the time, they would have seen themselves in a more nuanced, at least stratified fashion, but there was still historically a root there, a different world that, in a sense, Rome had even preserved in Gaul, and that had remained relatively, at least, separate from the Germans, or at least distant. So you can argue that paradoxically, it's as if these migrations overwhelmed the last Celtic strongholds, like assimilating their populations into Germanic or Roman frameworks. So bold take, because obviously Gaul was essentially Romanized, and we've seen also in the case of the Oppida that the Romans rebuilt entire actual cities away from this sort of smaller fortified hilltops in same places, sort of more functional ways with more resources and so on. But many of the same places were the same one, again, were half a millennium before that Celtic identity was sort of well alive, and still, again, the Anglo-Saxons kept battling against for example, the Romano-Britons. There is, I don't know, I think it's fair to say that probably Celtic identity was stronger in Britain than in Gaul by this time, right? But you see, there is a greater proclivity to consider the Britons more as Celts in general, because also the later Celtic fringe and this sort of, also the later English exceptionalism. But what about Gaul? What about the French? What happened there, right? It's incredibly important to stress, because language can change, but ancestry doesn't, and also history follows pretty unique paths. It's impossible to unsee. Like, where did all these Celts go, right? If anything, the most important country for explaining this is Gaul, right? So what we've seen here is fundamentally a picture of, like, the final question naturally is, did the Germans contribute also indirectly to Roman expansion? And the obvious answer is yes. Like, even though there wasn't like a paritary or comparably sort of scalar level of power involved, like, the Germans were pushing on the Celts because they were just these different waves. They probably didn't even consider themselves as separated as Germans and Celts in some broader terms, like we came to learn now. Of course, the Romans took over a Celtic war that was essentially spent and defeated. They simply said, look, if you don't intervene, the Germans will take over. This is largely how the Gauls ended up under Rome, because they sort of woke up in the end, like, saying this is the last chance, if anything, to remain independent, ideally. But they had themselves dramatically indebted towards Rome, that had obviously the means to conquer them and to keep the Germans out, and that's the scale by which you cannot compare, like, the players involved. You can compare the Germans and the Celts at large, but it's more like the Germans and the Gauls at this point rather than anything. And the Roman Empire, owing much to this dynamic, not in its existence, but let's say in its characters, right? In the fact how Caesar and Augustus properly conferred to the Roman Empire a continental European dimension, next to the Mediterranean one, there is also a continental one in the Italic hinterland, the Iberian hinterland. But say, when we look at the Celtic world that has developed mostly, again, in this northwestern axis up to Central Europe, parts of the Danube, mostly in a more easily recognizable way, aside from sort of large swathes of northern and central, even central Italy, parts of Spain, there were the Celtiberians we've seen recently. You realize, in my opinion, in fact, it's these regional hubs that mattered more, right? Gaul alone, if you look at the distribution of bell beaker sort of civilizational development historically, Gaul and Italy have always been central in that. And surprise, surprise, they're central in late antiquity, they're central in the Middle Ages, they're central in the modern age. How do you... Like, it's so straightforwardly continuous that it's impossible not to see how civilizationally impacting these relations really were, and how overall, if you think about it, cooperative we were. Because if you are habituated to conceive the Romans and the Gauls as cats and dogs, well, you should explain what the actual contrast really was. Most of also the mythological idea of the Gaul in ancient Rome, in archaic Rome, is fundamentally some broader provincial clashes, right? They're not something big where the Celts as a whole hate the Romans, as many people think today. It's mostly just like different tribes, mostly the Gallic war rather than the broader Celtic one, and a Gallic war that doesn't even fight against Caesar until the end, practically. And because the Romans were literally taking over, and most Gauls were actually Roman allies, and literally called the Romans to save them from the Germans. So in this sense, it's, as we've seen, for example, in that video about Celto-Italic linguistical and ethnic similarity, you realize that even the groups Centum, Satem, so on, always manifested this very old divide between Western Europe and Central Europe. Right? There are two very different things, and still people today conflate the two. Right? They don't see it for different reasons, actually. But as much as they don't see the Italian preeminence in all of this, it's difficult to have people have objective historical views. Especially, I realized throughout Schwerpunkt how easy it is. Like, imagine, like, I had never done all this work. Like, these things would not come out, right? They would not come out. They would not come up. It would all stay to some sort of subjective, sort of imaginific hypothesis of how you think history would have gone. Like, history has this, pretty satisfying habit of telling you how things are, regardless of what you want to believe for other reasons. And that's what teaches you, right? Before sort of gives you the sort of the mark before teaching you the lesson. It's not something you can go with in life without having properly browsed and understood. And again, I think it's incredibly important to appreciate our past in ways that are not driven by strange subjectivism and emotionalism. That's all. Basically, if you open X, you will find that. If you open X and you look at that, you realize how there is no historical awareness left anywhere. I don't know what YouTube does. I mean, in general, I see a lot of slop. Also, historical view at some point exasperates itself. If you're consistent and you build up historical knowledge, that's only through relentless effort. And this video is fairly long. I don't know if you've arrived to the end, but it's better if I quit it here, telling you the truth. And I hope that this was sort of explanatory enough. We'll make lots of other videos on the same topic. However, for today, stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.